The grand hall of the Galactic Peace Station gleamed under the artificial starlight. James Miller tugged at his too-tight collar, feeling completely out of place among the various alien delegates. At 28 years old, he was the youngest human diplomat present at the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Conference. "Just don't mess this up," he muttered to himself, repeating his supervisor's words. The Earth Diplomatic Corps had only sent him because their senior diplomat had fallen ill at the last minute. James was supposed to observe, stay quiet, and not cause any incidents. The Crystal Empire's delegation caught everyone's attention as they entered the hall. Their crystalline bodies refracted light in mesmerizing patterns, but none were as breathtaking as Queen Aurora. Unlike her subjects' transparent forms, her crystal structure had a subtle purple hue that seemed to pulse with inner light. James found himself staring, captivated by the way she moved with fluid grace despite appearing to be made of living crystal. He quickly looked away when one of her advisors noticed his gaze. During the formal dinner, James was seated surprisingly close to the Crystal Empire's table, a choice he would later learn was not as random as it seemed. The Queen's light patterns shifted in what he assumed was conversation with her advisors. The trouble began when James reached for the ceremonial wine glass. His hand brushed against a crystal flower centerpiece, causing it to chime with a pure, clear note. The Queen's head turned sharply toward the sound. To everyone's surprise, she stood and approached his table. The entire hall fell silent. James froze, wondering what protocol he had broken. Queen Aurora extended her hand, and a soft blue light pulsed from her crystalline palm. Not wanting to cause offense, James did what any diplomat would do. He reached out and took her hand. The moment their hands touched, her crystal structure lit up in a dazzling display of colors. The assembled delegates gasped. "Oh dear," an older diplomat at his table whispered. "The young human has no idea what he just did." Before James could ask what was happening, Queen Aurora's advisor announced in the universal translation frequency, "The Queen has chosen. The sacred bond of light has been witnessed." James stood there, still holding the Queen's hand, as the hall erupted in a mixture of cheers, shocked exclamations, and what sounded like several arguments in various alien languages. His supervisor rushed over, face pale. "Miller, you just completed the Crystal Empire's royal marriage ritual. The Queen offered her light, and you accepted it." "I'd what?" James felt the room spin slightly. "But I didn't know. I was just trying to be polite." The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency meetings. James learned that the ritual was considered absolutely binding, witnessed by representatives from 50 different worlds. Breaking it would not only shame both parties, but could potentially trigger a diplomatic crisis between Earth and the Crystal Empire. Queen Aurora, through her translators, explained that she had been intrigued by him from the moment she arrived. His inner light, as she called it, had drawn her attention. The wine glass chime had simply given her the perfect opportunity to act. But surely there's some way to undo this, James asked desperately during a private meeting with both human and crystal advisors. The Queen's lights pulsed in patterns that the translator interpreted as amusement. "Why would I want to undo finding a partner whose soul resonates so perfectly with mine?" James sat in his temporary quarters that night, staring out at the stars. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from junior diplomat to being married to an alien queen. Earth's government was simultaneously congratulating him and trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. He looked at his hand, still tingling from where he had touched her crystalline palm. Whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. Somehow, through a simple gesture of politeness, he had started what would become one of the most remarkable chapters in human-alien relations. The royal palace of the Crystal Empire was unlike anything James had ever seen. Towering spires of pure crystal stretched toward the twin purple suns, each surface catching and reflecting light in mesmerizing patterns. It had been 2 weeks since his accidental marriage, and he was still struggling to adjust to his new home. His personal quarters, while beautiful, presented unique challenges. The walls themselves pulsed with light, a standard form of communication among the crystal people. At first, he couldn't sleep with the constant flickering, until the palace engineers installed special dampening fields for his comfort. "Your Majesty's mate seems to be having difficulty adapting," one of the advisors commented, their body flickering with what James had learned was concern. He was still getting used to being called Your Majesty's mate instead of his name. Queen Aurora's response was a brilliant display of purple and gold lights cascading through her form. The translator pinned to James's collar converted it. "He is doing remarkably well for someone whose species does not share our light speech. His determination is admirable." James felt warmth spread through his chest at her defense of him. Over the past weeks, he had discovered that despite their drastically different biologies, Aurora had a gentle and patient nature. She spent hours teaching him the basics of light speech, even though he could only observe and not replicate it. The palace staff was another matter entirely. They seemed split into two distinct camps. The younger crystal people were fascinated by him, constantly asking questions about Earth and human customs. The older, more traditional staff members viewed him with barely concealed suspicion, their bodies dimming whenever he passed by. The crystal equivalent of turning one's back. One morning, James discovered he couldn't open his bedroom door. The crystal panel that usually responded to touch remained stubbornly inactive. After 15 minutes of frustration, a young palace servant found him. The night shift changed the resonance frequency, they explained, lights flickering with embarrassment. "Some believe you should learn our ways rather than us accommodating yours." Queen Aurora was furious when she learned of the incident. Her entire form blazed with such intensity that James had to shield his eyes. The traditional faction quickly learned that while they might disapprove of their queen's choice, openly disrespecting her mate would not be tolerated. The biggest challenge came during his first public appearance. The crystal people communicated complex ideas through synchronized light displays. During important ceremonies, hundreds would join their lights together in beautiful patterns telling ancient stories. James stood beside Aurora, feeling helplessly out of place as the lights danced around him. Then Aurora did something unprecedented. She dimmed her lights to match his natural form, standing with him in simple solidarity. The crowd fell silent, their lights dimming in response to their queen's display. "You do not need to shine as we do," she told him later through the translator. "Your strength shows in different ways. That is why you intrigue me so." James began to notice small changes in the palace. Crystal surfaces were modified to be less slippery for his human feet. The kitchen learned to prepare Earth-style foods alongside their energy-based sustenance. His quarters were adjusted to Earth-standard gravity and atmosphere. Most surprisingly, he found himself adapting too. He began to recognize different light patterns without the translator's help. He learned to read the subtle pulses that indicated emotions in his new people. While he couldn't communicate back in their way, he found that genuine effort and respect went a long way. "You are changing us," his personal advisor noted one evening, their lights pulsing thoughtfully. "And perhaps we are changing you too. Not since the ancient times has our society faced such adaptation." James looked out at the crystal city below, glowing with millions of light conversations. "Change isn't always a bad thing," he replied, thinking of how his accidental marriage was slowly transforming into something meaningful. Sometimes it's exactly what we need. 3 months into his new life, James found himself sitting in on his first Council of Light meeting. The crystal chamber was filled with the Empire's highest advisors, their bodies creating an intricate dance of light patterns as they debated policy. Though his translator worked overtime, he still struggled to follow all the nuances. The main topic was a trade dispute with the mining guilds of the outer colonies. The crystal people needed specific minerals to maintain their physical forms, but the miners were demanding higher prices, claiming the work was too dangerous. The traditional solution would be to simply take what we need by force. One elderly council member pulsed, their light patterns sharp and aggressive. "We are the Crystal Empire. We do not bow to the demands of colony worlds." James shifted uncomfortably in his specially designed chair. After weeks of studying empire history, he knew that such aggressive policies had caused problems in the past. He raised his hand, an earth gesture that still confused many of the crystal people. Queen Aurora's lights flickered in what he now recognized as amusement. "My mate wishes to speak," she announced, causing several council members to dim slightly in disapproval. "Have we considered why the miners find the work so dangerous?" James asked, keeping his voice steady despite his nervousness. "On Earth, we've learned that worker safety and fair compensation usually lead to better production than forced labor." The chamber erupted in a chaos of light patterns. His translator struggled to keep up with multiple conversations happening at once. Some council members were offended by the suggestion that their traditional methods might be flawed, while others showed interest in this new perspective. "Explain further," Aurora encouraged him, her purple light pulsing warmly. James stood, remembering his diplomatic training. "What if we invested in better mining equipment? Safer conditions would mean more efficient extraction. We could even train crystal people to work alongside the miners, showing we value their work enough to do it ourselves." The council chamber fell silent, lights dimming to thoughtful pulses. James held his breath, wondering if he'd overstepped. To everyone's surprise, the head of the Economic Council began to glow with approval. "The human's logic is sound. Our records show that colonial resistance has cost us more in military resources than these proposed improvements would require." Over the next few hours, James watched in amazement as the council developed a new approach to colonial relations. His simple suggestion had sparked a complete revision of centuries-old policies. Later that evening, in their private chambers, Aurora's lights danced with pride. "You handled the council well today," the translator conveyed. "Many of them are beginning to see why I chose you." James laughed softly. "Chose me? I thought our marriage was an accident." Aurora's crystal form shimmered with what he had learned was their equivalent of laughter. "I had watched you since you arrived at the peace station. Your internal light shines differently from any being I've encountered. When you touched the ceremonial flower, it was the perfect opportunity." "You mean you planned it?" James sat up straighter, surprised. "Not exactly planned," she pulsed. "But I hoped you would respond as you did. Your species' diplomacy intrigues me. You seek understanding rather than dominance." James thought about how much he'd learned in 3 months. He could now recognize over 50 different light patterns without his translator. He understood the complex hierarchy of crystal society, and even some of their ancient legends. Most importantly, he was beginning to see how his different perspective could help bridge the gap between crystal and human ways of thinking. "I still have so much to learn," he admitted. Aurora's lights softened to a gentle glow. "As do I. That is why we make a good pair. 2 different ways of seeing, making both our people stronger." Looking at his alien wife, James realized that what had started as a diplomatic mishap was becoming something far more meaningful. They were creating a new way forward, one careful step at a time. The celebration of James and Aurora's 6-month union filled the Crystal Palace with dazzling light displays. Delegates from Earth mingled with crystal nobility, a sight that would have seemed impossible less than a year ago. James was just beginning to relax, thinking perhaps he had finally found his place in this glittering world. That's when he noticed something wrong with the light patterns in the far corner of the Grand Hall. After months of study, he had learned to recognize the subtle differences between decorative displays and communication. These patterns were neither. They were too sharp, too focused. His time in Earth's diplomatic security training kicked in. He made his way casually toward Aurora, who was speaking with Earth's ambassador. The strange light patterns were moving too, creating what looked like a convergence point. "Aurora," he said quietly, touching her arm. "Something's not right." Before he could explain further, he saw it. A darkness spreading through the crystal pillars around them, like ink through water. The crystal people began to react in panic, their lights flickering frantically. Whatever was spreading through the crystal structure was blocking their ability to communicate through light. "Get down," James shouted, pulling Aurora to the floor just as a beam of concentrated energy shot through the space where she had been standing. The beam hit the wall behind them, leaving a scorched mark on the previously perfect crystal surface. The grand hall erupted into chaos. The darkness continued to spread, cutting off more and more light communication. Crystal guards rushed forward, but they were clearly disoriented without their ability to coordinate through light patterns. James's human eyes, accustomed to working without light speech, quickly spotted the attackers. 3 crystal people, their forms modified to absorb light rather than transmit it, were moving through the confusion with deadly purpose. "They're using our dependency on light speech against us," Aurora said through the translator, her voice tight with anger. "Most of our defense systems require light coordination to function." James remembered his combat training. "Then we do this the human way. Stay close to me." He led Aurora behind a pillar, then grabbed a ceremonial staff from a nearby display. The crystal weapon felt strange in his hands, but it was better than nothing. The attackers were getting closer, probably assuming their targets would be helpless in the artificial darkness. They weren't expecting a human response. James swung the staff low, catching the first attacker off guard and shattering their light-absorbing outer layer. Aurora, quick to adapt, used her own light to temporarily blind the second attacker while James dealt with them. The third attacker proved more challenging. They fired another energy beam, forcing James and Aurora to dive behind a different pillar. The beam cut through the crystal floor, leaving smoking trenches in its wake. The pillars, James suddenly realized. They're all connected to the main crystal matrix, right? Aurora's lights pulsed in confirmation. "Can you send a power surge through them? Overload their light-absorbing modifications." Aurora understood immediately. She placed her hand on the pillar, and her purple light began to spread through the crystal structure. The remaining attacker tried to fire again, but their modified form couldn't handle the sudden surge of pure crystal energy. The darkness receded as quickly as it had come. Palace guards finally managed to coordinate and secure the area. The attackers were revealed to be members of a radical traditionalist faction, opposed to any change in crystal society, especially the human influence their queen had embraced. Later, as medical staff treated their minor injuries, Aurora's lights pulsed with a new pattern James had never seen before. "What does that mean?" he asked, pointing to the translator. "It doesn't have a direct translation," the device explained. "The closest would be, 'My heart shines brighter knowing you guard it.'" James took her crystalline hand in his. What had started as an accidental marriage had become something he would fight to protect. The assassination attempt had failed, but more importantly, it had proven that their different natures could be a strength rather than a weakness. "We make a good team," he said simply. Aurora's answering light display needed no translation at all. The first sign that something was wrong came during a routine morning meeting. James felt dizzy, his vision blurring slightly as he tried to focus on the light patterns of the council members. He blamed it on lack of sleep, but by the end of the week, the symptoms had gotten worse. The palace medical team ran several tests, their crystal forms pulsing with increasing concern as they reviewed the results. Aurora stayed by his side, her usually bright purple glow dimmed with worry. "Your body is showing signs of crystal radiation poisoning," the chief medical officer finally announced, their lights pulsing in carefully controlled patterns. "The natural energy field that sustains our people is affecting your human physiology." James sat on the examination table, trying to process this information. "How bad is it?" The crystal doctor's lights flickered in a pattern that his translator interpreted as deep concern. "Without intervention, you have perhaps 1 Earth year before the damage becomes irreversible. Even now, prolonged exposure is causing cellular degradation." Aurora's form flashed with patterns so intense that the translator struggled to keep up. "There must be a solution. We have the finest minds in the Empire. Surely we can find a way to protect him." The next few weeks became a blur of tests and treatments. Scientists from both Earth and the Crystal Empire worked together. trying to find a way to shield James from the harmful effects of crystal energy while allowing him to continue living in the palace. Different protective suits were tried and discarded. Force field technologies proved too unstable. Every failure seemed to dim Aurora's light a little more, though she tried to hide it from him. "Perhaps I should return to Earth," James suggested one evening, his heart heavy. "At least until a solution is found." Aurora's form pulsed with such sudden pain that he immediately regretted his words. The separation would be difficult, she admitted, her lights barely a whisper through the translator. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source. A young crystal scientist, working with a human biologist, discovered that certain Earth deep-sea creatures had natural protection against various forms of radiation. "If we could modify human DNA with these protective qualities," the scientist explained, their lights pulsing with excitement, "we might be able to help your body adapt to our environment, rather than trying to shield you from it." The procedure was experimental and risky. It would involve changing James at a fundamental level, adding engineered genes derived from deep-sea life forms. The changes would be permanent. "We don't know exactly how it will affect you," the human doctor warned. "You might develop some unusual characteristics." James looked at Aurora, whose light had been growing steadily dimmer with each passing day of his illness. He thought about the life they had built together, the changes they had brought to both their peoples. Was he willing to change himself to preserve that? "Do it," he said firmly. The procedure took 3 days. James floated in a tank of specially prepared fluid while machines guided the genetic modifications. Aurora never left the medical chamber, her light providing a constant beacon through his periods of consciousness. When he finally emerged, he felt different. His skin had a slight iridescent quality, almost like the surface of a soap bubble. More surprisingly, he found he could sense the crystal energy fields around him, feeling them as gentle pressures against his new altered skin. "The procedure appears to be successful," the chief medical officer announced, their lights pulsing with relief. "Your body is no longer showing signs of radiation damage. In fact, you seem to be adapting to our environment better than we hoped." Aurora approached him carefully, her light questioning. James reached out, and for the first time, he could feel the warmth of her crystal energy against his modified skin. It no longer hurt. Instead, it felt like stepping into warm sunlight. "I can feel your light," he whispered in awe. Aurora's joy manifested as a dazzling display that lit up the entire medical chamber. James had changed himself to stay with her, and in doing so, had brought their worlds one step closer together. 2 months after his genetic modification, James stood before his mirror, fascinated by how his skin shimmered in the crystal light. The changes had gone far beyond simple radiation resistance. His modified cells had continued to adapt, developing in ways that surprised both human and crystal scientists. "Try it again," Aurora encouraged him, her purple light pulsing gently. "Focus on the feeling." James concentrated, and slowly, patches of his skin began to glow with a soft blue light. The patterns were nothing like the complex communications of the crystal people, but they were definitely noticeable. It had started as random flashes a week ago, but now he could control it somewhat. "Remarkable," said the lead scientist, recording the display. "Your cells have developed bioluminescent properties similar to our crystalline structures. Not as advanced, but far beyond what we expected." The news of James's transformation spread quickly through the empire. Many who had opposed his presence now saw his willingness to change himself as a sign of true dedication to their people. The traditional faction found it harder to argue against someone who had literally altered his biology to better serve the empire. But the changes weren't just physical. James found that his new sensitivity to crystal energy helped him understand their society on a deeper level. He could feel the subtle shifts in energy that marked important ceremonies, sense the ancient power running through the palace walls, and even detect the emotions of crystal people nearby. "Your mate grows more fascinating each day, Your Majesty," one of the elder council members admitted, their lights showing genuine respect. "He bridges our worlds in ways we never thought possible." The scientific implications were enormous. The success of James's modification opened new possibilities for human crystal cooperation. Research teams began studying ways to help other humans safely visit crystal worlds, while crystal scientists explored new ways to interact with human biology. One morning, during a diplomatic meeting, James noticed something odd. He could feel the crystal ambassadors' energy patterns shifting in a way that didn't match their visible light display. Without thinking, his skin flashed a warning pattern to Aurora. The ambassador was revealed to be using hidden energy frequencies to communicate secretly with others, a serious breach of diplomatic protocol. James's unique ability to sense both human and crystal deception had uncovered a potential spy. "You're becoming something entirely new," Aurora told him later that night, her light mixing with his faint blue glow. "Neither fully human nor crystal, but something in between. A true bridge between our peoples." James practiced his light patterns daily, slowly developing his own unique way of communicating. While he couldn't match the complexity of true crystal speech, he could now express basic emotions and warnings through his bioluminescence. The crystal people learned to read his simpler patterns, just as he had learned to read theirs. The modification had another unexpected effect. His lifespan was now predicted to match Aurora's. The same changes that protected him from crystal radiation had strengthened his cellular structure, potentially extending his life by centuries. "I never dared hope for this," Aurora admitted, her light showing deep emotion. "I thought our time together would be limited by your human lifespan." Scientists from both worlds continued to study him, amazed by how his modified body kept adapting. Each new development brought fresh insights into both human and crystal biology. His unique condition became a symbol of what their peoples could achieve together. "Your transformation goes beyond the physical," his personal advisor observed one day. "You've helped transform our entire society's understanding of adaptation and change." Looking out at the Crystal City, James realized just how far he'd come from that accidental marriage. He had changed in ways he never imagined possible, not just to survive in this world, but to truly become part of it. He let his skin glow in response to Aurora's light, their patterns mixing in a simple but beautiful display. He was no longer just a human trying to fit into a crystal world. He had become living proof that their two species could not only coexist, but evolve together into something greater. A year had passed since James's transformation, and the Crystal Palace was hosting the largest diplomatic gathering in its history. Representatives from 50 different worlds watched in amazement as the human-crystal hybrid walked alongside Queen Aurora, his skin giving off a soft blue glow that complemented her purple radiance. Who would have thought? The Earth ambassador whispered to his aide that an accidental marriage would lead to the biggest breakthrough in interspecies relations. The success of James's genetic modification had sparked a revolution in cross-species adaptation technology. 3 more human diplomats had already undergone similar procedures, modified to suit different alien environments. Each transformation brought new insights and possibilities. James stood at the podium, his skin flickering with gentle light patterns that the crystal people had come to recognize as his personal signature. "A year ago, I was afraid I would have to leave this world and my beloved Aurora. Today, I stand before you as living proof that our differences need not divide us." The grand hall sparkled with approval as crystal delegates pulsed their agreement. Human observers watched in fascination as James responded to their light patterns with his own simplified but meaningful displays. Under their joint leadership, the Crystal Empire had flourished. James's human perspective combined with Aurora's crystal wisdom led to innovative solutions to age-old problems. The outer colonies, once restless, now sent regular delegations to share their success stories. Trade has increased by 300%. The Economic Council reported, their lights showing satisfaction. The human concept of mutual benefit has proven remarkably effective. But perhaps the most significant change was in the crystal people themselves. Younger crystal citizens began experimenting with simplified light patterns that humans could more easily understand. Humans, in turn, developed technologies to better perceive and respond to crystal communications. "Look," Aurora said softly, directing James's attention to a corner of the hall where a young crystal noble was teaching a human diplomat basic light reading without any translation technology. They're learning each other's ways naturally now. The Crystal Empire had become a hub for interspecies cooperation. Research centers studied James's successful adaptation, working to develop safe methods for other species to survive in different environments. The palace itself had been modified to accommodate visitors from dozens of worlds. James felt a familiar warmth as Aurora's light merged with his glow. Their ability to communicate through light had deepened over time, becoming something more intimate than words could express. What had started as a diplomatic accident had evolved into a deep bond that transcended species. "The old stories," one of the crystal elders commented, their lights showing wonder, "speak of a time when all beings could share the same light." Perhaps they weren't just legends after all. The evening culminated in a ceremony that would have been impossible a year ago. A joint light-sharing display. Humans with modified genes stood alongside crystal people, their combined bioluminescence creating patterns of stunning beauty. The message was clear. Barriers between species were meant to be overcome. "Did you ever imagine this future?" James asked Aurora as they watched the display. "When you chose me at that first diplomatic dinner." Aurora's light danced with amusement. "I saw possibility in you. But this," her pattern shifted to one of joy, "this has exceeded even my highest hopes." Looking out at the gathering, James saw not just humans and crystal people, but representatives from countless worlds, all watching with interest as two very different species showed what was possible through understanding and adaptation. A small child, half human, half crystal, approached them shyly, her skin showing faint patterns of both species. She was one of several children born to modified human crystal couples, representing an entirely new chapter in their shared history. "The future," Aurora pulsed gently, watching the child, "will be brighter than we imagined." James let his own light respond, joining with Aurora's in a pattern that had become their own private symbol of hope. What had begun as an accidental marriage had grown into something that would change the galaxy forever, one shared light at a time.